So today I got a graphics card in here, and this one is actually kind of interesting, at least in my opinion, and we'll talk about that a bunch, obviously. So I was on the old eBay, and guys, I gotta say, I kind of like eBay a lot, and that's actually been my go-to lately because you could get some really good deals, you could find some really bad deals, and you could take some pretty interesting risks. So about, I would say maybe a couple of weeks ago, browsing the eBay, just looking for graphics cards for budget builds that I got going on in the garage, and this one popped up, a Radeon HD7970, and this was going for $30, and it had no reserve, and that was the price, so I put in a bid. A couple of days later, I won it. Now, according to the seller, this did work. They had no issues with it, and it was fine. So now, why did I pay $30? Well, I think one of the reasons why we paid $30 is because, well, number one, it has a water cooling block. And yes, granted, this is a very nice water cooling block. This is an older graphics card, and not many people are going to buy a 8-year-old graphics card and spend $200 in a water cooling kit just to have an 8-year-old graphics card. And then those people trying to mine with whatever graphics cards they could scratch around, well, you're not going to make too much money unless you get a nice water cooling kit for it. And even then, it's just easier just to have an air cooler just so you could slot it in and try to hash every few pennies that you can. That's just my opinion on it. So let's go ahead. Let's talk about this and some of the specs. So in correction to my earlier comment, this was actually released in December of 2011. The HD7970 was a high-end graphics card by AMD, and it was built on the 28nm process and based on the Tahiti graphics processor. In its Tahiti XT variant, the card supports DirectX 12. Even though it supports DirectX 12, the features level is only 11.1, which can be problematic with newer DirectX 12 titles. It features 2048 shading units, 128 texture mapping units, and 32 ROPs. And it's paired with a 3 GB GDDR5 memory, which is connected using a 384-bit memory interface. Its operating frequency is 925 MHz, and the memory is running 1375 MHz. Now, typically these are a dual slot card, and I'll talk about that in just a sec, but the HD7970 draws power from one 6-pin connector and one 8-pin power connector and draws a rated of 250 watts maximum. Now, display outputs include one DVI, one HDMI, two mini display ports, and it's connected using PCI Express 3.0 at 16 interface. Now, the card's dimensions are 275mm by 111mm by 38mm, and typically it features a dual slot cooling solution, although this one has a EK water block on it. Price at launch was $549 US, and for inflation in 2021, that equates to $663 US. So now for $30, I actually think it's actually a really good deal if you have a water cooling loop. But considering how old it is, and we don't know how well used and abused it has been, we need to kind of make sure that this loop is pretty clean. Now, I did go ahead and do some initial testing. I just plugged it in, fired it up. I used some fans just to kind of cool it off, just to make sure that this thing fired. Was able to manage the temperatures less suspiciously, ideally, but just enough to make sure that if there was a problem, I could get a refund from the seller. Remember, when you get these used graphics cards, pop them in, fire them up, see if they work. If they work, then go ahead and do the whole cleaning process. If not, then contact the seller on eBay and deal with the situation that way. So now, this water block was designed for the HD7970 and the HD7950. It provides direct cooling for the GPU, the RAM, as well as the VRAM. And this allowed the graphics card and its VRMs to remain stable under high overclocks. Now, this water block does feature a high flow design, and therefore it can be easily used in liquid cooling systems using weaker water pumps. Now, EK, doing my research, because this is a custom water block for it, they did offer the single slot bracket for this, so that is why that on this card, as you can see, we only have a single slot versus typical dual slot, which I think is pretty cool. I don't know if a lot of newer cards do that, but yeah, that's pretty nice. And then with this, well, I guess at the time, if you were doing the whole SLI thing, would save a lot of room in real estate. And that bracket, of course, was an add-on that you had to pay an additional for. Go figure. So now, let's go ahead and let's take this apart, take a look at it, and clean it up. The back plate has 4 Torx in the back, so make sure you have a good kit that has the Torx bit for it. I think it's an 8 if I'm not mistaken. Carefully pry this off. We got screws over here, so let's take these out. Now I've never taken this apart, so we're doing this together. Alright, and this should separate it. And we were able to save the thermal pads on it. Cool. Thermal pads seem okay, and they appear to be intact. So now let's take off all these screws over here. These are once again Phillips screws. And let's get this card apart. Should be all of them, and this thing should separate. Bingo. It's interesting that I was able to get this thing to work pretty decent as it is, considering that the thermal paste on it is pretty much like non-existent. So how interesting on that. I mean, it's there, but it just didn't have good contact for whatever reason. So either they didn't do a good spread of it, or I don't know. It looks like they didn't do a good spread, because this is like hardly anything on it, not to mention it's dried. So alright, this is the card. Now if you saw this, I already saw this, check it out. Green crusties, and I tell you what, that joker looks angry. It is surprising that this card actually worked, although I didn't test it on the display port, but the HDMI seemed to work fine. So I think what we'll do is we'll get some contact cleaner, spray this out, clean it with a little toothbrush, and then see if we can make that either prettier or working. But the card does work, and it works pretty solid, so that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with this, and then we'll move to the water block. One of my recommended tools is a toothbrush. Use an old one, not the one that you use to brush your teeth. And I use the CRC QD electronic cleaner. I've used this on electronic. It works great for automotives. I've actually repaired ECMs and modules with it, so we know it could work for computers. Spray this off lightly, well, as light as I can, and take my toothbrush and kind of get in there and see if we could just clean that off. I think at this point it's more so the fact of just trying to make it look pretty, because I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't use a DVI port for it. And as you can see, it seems to be really breaking this up pretty good. And it's pretty crusty in there. And this is the only part of the board that I have found that seems to have suffered some damage, so probably a little bit of liquid got in there. It's hard to say, but it looks like something wet got in here. Maybe this was used for mining at one point. I don't know. It's hard to say. Or just somebody spilled on it. Get a little bit of the Coca-Cola or water or your favorite adult beverage. Now I think that's about the best I'm going to be able to get it off, because it's pretty stained on into there, but at least the corrosion is not completing the contacts. But then again, that's probably what kept this thing working, so we might have made this worse. I decided that I'm actually not going to show on this video how to take this apart and clean it. I'm actually going to do a separate guide on GPU water block cleaning, my recommendation, my tips. So I've already gone, disassembled this, clean it, just to kind of give you guys some tips in case you're watching this video and you just want to know. Take it apart, double check your gaskets. I like to clean it with soapy water with a toothbrush, scrub it lightly. Check the gaskets to make sure they're not brittle, cracked, broken, and all that stuff. And then once you clean it up real good, you can actually take a Scotch pad like this, and anything that's like really hard or stuck to the acrylic, just put a little bit of water on it, and without using any pressure, just rub it lightly and just add slight pressure as needed. I mean, barely any pressure, and that will actually clean up any of the green crusties or corrosion that got stuck on it. And the same thing with the copper block. If it's really that bad in here, a lot of the times it could be just eaten away, or just the copper just kind of coming off a little bit, but it's fine. I did it with this one, and as you can see right over here, I really can't get rid of all that green crusty stuff, but that's just the metal, and it is what it is on that. But we were able to make it at least better and ensure that when we plug this back into our water cooling loop, that we're not going to get that crud that was in here and mess up our pump. So man, it's been a long day. But this card is pretty good, not too bad. So let me start off. First off, it is about almost 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I started this at 8 o'clock, and man, we ran into some issues. The soft tubing lines, I had the wrong sizes, didn't realize it. We had water leaking, and yeah, I didn't record it, but didn't really feel like recording it. And quite a disaster. A couple of trips back and forth to Lowe's. We're good to go. So we're using our Chinese water cooling loop, cheap, and I use this for a whole bunch of other builds, projects, anything. Anytime I have anything with water cooling, this has always been my go-to because number one, it's cheap and I have it. Our CPU is the i7-7800X on the X299 platform, 16 gigs of DDR4, 3000 memory, and this is the HD7970 graphics cards that we're using. Came with an EK water block. We cleaned it out and it performs very well. So as far as temperatures, honestly, this thing sat in the 50s. I think the highest I was able to spike it up to was maybe 60. So I went through 3 different games. Didn't even bother with the Cyberpunk just because, well, we all know how that one's going to play out. So Shadow of the Tomb Raider, 1080p, normal settings, anti-aliasing, SMAA, average 44 frames per second. Playable experience, looked good and quite enjoyable. So very happy with that. Fortnite 1080p high settings, 55 frames per second was the lowest dips that we would have, and so 55 to 60 frames per second looked great and quite enjoyed it. So great experience on that. GTA 5 1080p high settings, DirectX 11, we were averaging 80 frames per second. So overall, it's actually not a bad graphics card, and honestly, if this thing had the factory air cooler on it, this would be some awesome bang for the buck. Especially considering that I paid $30. Now, I paid $30 primarily because it's water cooled and you're kind of obligated to that whole ecosystem of cooling for it. But for the simple fact that I do have it, and maybe we could get a aftermarket air cooler later on, because I haven't been able to find the OEM one. So if any of you guys have any tips or information where I can get an OEM one for this graphics card, definitely chime down below. Definitely like to look into that. Where we're at with this card. The equivalent of it would be, honestly, going back in the day, would be the GTX 760, as they kind of went par and par. They also talked about the 680 Ti that was also kind of par in it, so they kind of fall in the range. As far as a more modern card, I found the 1050 Ti just to be maybe 10% faster than it, so that kind of gives you an idea of what you're looking for. The card on eBay right now is going for about 100 to 150 US dollars when you can get the 1050 Ti also for the same price. Kind of weird. Well, the 1050 Ti I've seen about more 150 to 200, so gives you an idea of how weird the GPU economy is. In a nutshell, is the card worth it? Most definitely, if you have a water cooling loop on it. If it had an air cooling loop, I actually do recommend this card. I mean, it's a decent 1080p starter card, works great for medium to high settings in most games. As far as like Cyberpunk, I'd imagine, considering I have tested the GTX 760, which is the equivalent, we probably could pay 720p and medium to low settings and probably tiptoe around 30 frames per second, if I'm not mistaken. Don't quote me 100% on that one, but if I'm not mistaken, I think that's where we kind of tiptoed on GTX 760. So the HD7970, great card. I think this is a pretty cool block that we have with it, and if we notice, the stickers are just kind of coming apart on it. So hope you guys enjoyed the video. Comment down below, let me know your thoughts, your opinions on the HD7970 water cooled with the EK water block. If you liked the video, definitely hit the like button, subscribe if you're not, and as always, we'll see what we come up with next.